Just waiting on the stream to update or to go live. There it is. Nope. There it is. Cool.
We're live.
We are live. I'm going to copy this link and tweet it out. And we're good to go. So take it away.
Sweet. So we are live. It's me, the NASCAR expert, Matt Friedman, Matt at the Oracle of Fantasy Labs and RotoViz. This is the March 26th, 2017 NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. As always, I'm here with Dr. Nick Giffen at RotoDoc, an editor at RotoViz, a PhD in mathematics, a two-time qualifier for the DraftKings NASCAR main event, and one of the best NASCAR DFS players in the world. Nick, how's it going?
I'm doing swell, man. I'd be doing a lot better if Xavier won yesterday. I don't know if you've been following my college basketball exploits, but can't win them all. But I was willing to let it ride. I mean, turning 20 or 25, I think it was 25 was my initial bet. Dollars into potentially 3,500 would have been nice, but wasn't meant to be. So that's okay. But we've got NASCAR, so I'm ready to make my 3,500 back with NASCAR.
All right, well, let's start. So obviously we had the show that came out yesterday, but there were practices since then, and some drivers have moved to the back of the field since then. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, so there's a couple situations where drivers are now going to be starting from the back. After qualifying, they got moved to the back of the field, so their qualifying position still remains where they are. So the first driver, which everybody's been asking me about on Twitter, is Dale Earnhardt Jr. Dale Earnhardt Jr. qualified 18th, so he is, for DraftKings scoring purposes, starting 18th. However, before the green flag, he will move to the back of the field and take the green flag from the tail end of the field. Again, he's still being scored from the 18th starting position for DraftKings scoring purposes. And the reason is they found a punctured tire in his qualifying tire. And since you have to start the race on the set of tires that you qualified on, because of the fact that he had to change one of the tires, that means he has to go to the back. Goodyear recommended that he change the tire. Can't start the race on that puncture. So a lot of people have been saying, well, is Dale Earnhardt Jr. a must-play now because they think he's starting 39th in terms of DraftKings scoring, but he's not. He's starting 18th. So now everybody then asks me, well, is he a must-fade now? And I'm saying no. Auto Club Speedway, we will get a lot of cautions. We will have plenty of time for Dale Earnhardt Jr. to make up position. The other funny thing is he gets one extra tire now because he gets to put that fresh tire on to replace the puncture. So he will have one fresh tire, which will be good. It'll help him pass a lot of those back marker cars where in a place where tires really do matter. So it's not going to be a huge advantage because it's only one tire, but anything helps. So not worried about Dale Earnhardt Jr. playing like you would normally. The only maybe there's like a tiny extra risk of like him getting involved in somebody's crash, but I really don't think so. So I play Dale Jr. like normal. The other guy is David Ragan. Ragan hit the wall in practice because something broke. I think he ran over a piece of debris and got a punctured tire and hit the wall. So he's going to his backup car. Don't play David Ragan this week. First of all, he qualified pretty high. He qualified 27th. He's priced up this week, which I think is a little weird. He's priced at 6,400, so he's above like Danica Patrick. He's above Ty Dillon. So the fact that he's going to his backup car, that matters a whole lot more for a small team than it does for a big team like Jimmy Johnson, where Jimmy Johnson's in a backup car, but of course he starts 37th anyway. But like the difference between the primary and the backup for an elite team like Hendrick Motorsports with Jimmy Johnson is minuscule compared to the difference between the primary and the backup for a team like Front Row Motorsports. So I'm not using David Ragan whatsoever. He looked pretty slow anyway in practice before he went to the backup car. I don't expect the backup car to be any better. So those are the two kind of situations we have since qualifying.
Awesome. So we've got a lot of questions on Twitter. We're going to get to those. First, though, I want to remind everyone that you can get a 30% discount to a special NASCAR pass through our NASCAR podcast homepage, rotoviz.com/NASCAR podcast. With that pass, you get unlimited access to all of Nick's premium NASCAR content, and your subscription supports the pod. And then also don't forget about Nick's NASCAR courses at Roto Academy. One of them is a video course with JN to Win at Roto Grinders. So, of course, you can find those at rotogrinders.com/Roto Academy. Okay, Nick, let's talk about Auto Club, and specifically, let's, I think, pick up where we left off from the podcast, which is you have three guys who qualified near the back of the field because they didn't run like qualifying laps. So talk about those three guys specifically. So we have this question. I'm having a hard time not going all in on Johnson, Logano, and Bain for GPPs and cash. Can you talk me out of it?
For cash, it's totally fine. That's the way to go. So 100% I would use Logano, Johnson, and Bain in cash. That is a super safe way to build your lineup. Huge floor there, lots of upside. That's like exactly what you want in cash games. On the GPP side of it, I'm going to do a little math here. Obviously I'm a math guy. So let's say just hypothetically that each driver has a 65% chance of being in the winning lineup because maybe there's a 20% chance they DNF, which is ballpark about where we think they'll be. Maybe 15% for like Logano and Johnson, maybe like 25% for Bain. And then even if they don't DNF, there's sometimes things can go wrong. So let's say each of them has a 65% chance. Then if they're independent of each other, which they should be, then the probability of all three of them being in the winning lineup is still only 27%. So, if you go all in 100% on all three of them, then you are like 73% overweight on the likelihood that they will all be in the winning lineup. So, that's a simple calculation, very basic. And I think that might be a little generous to Bain in terms of his probability as well. So, I think there's less than a 25% chance all three are in the winning lineup just because things happen at Auto Club. It's not impossible, of course, for all three of them to be in the winning lineup, but I think that, let's say 65% each, maybe even if we give like 70% credit to Johnson and Logano and 65% credit to Bain, we're still talking 32% chance of all three of them being in the winning lineup. So you're still going to be 68% overweight. So I am not going all in on all three. I think in GPPs that doesn't make sense, especially at a track like Auto Club where there's a lot of variability.
Mm-hmm. And the one out of those three that you would be most inclined to fade, is that Bain or what's your strategy?
Yeah, so my strategy, actually, I think just looking at practice times and the fact that Johnson is in a backup car, I know that doesn't matter a ton, but he did say, I don't want to be driving in reverse all weekend. So that was kind of a key there for me. And then I look at the practice times, his single lap was kind of 15th, his 10-lap average was kind of like 15th. So I don't know if that's going to be enough compared to maybe what Logano can get us. Logano practiced inside the top 6 in both single lap and 10-lap average. Single lap matters a lot more in terms of the model. So I think Logano just looks stronger than Johnson. Bain looks fine. If he gets in the top 15 at his $3,000 discount, to Logano and Johnson, $2,500, $3,000 discount there. If he gets up to 15th or 18th or 16th, that's totally fine. So I'm actually most inclined to fade Jimmy Johnson. I think the little hint of the backup car issue, the practice a little bit, and just the fact that he's already had some issues. I'm most inclined to fade Johnson of the three.
Well, you are a Bain truther, so I should have expected that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going like crazy on Bain, but I think I probably have him about 55%. So I think I'm probably right around where I expect him to be in terms of probability of being in the winning lineup.
Mm-hmm. All right. I like this question. Could you explain your strategy for 3 entry max tournaments?
Yes, this is a great question. So there's a little bit I don't want to give away because I'm in a $333 3 max. But I will say I'm not going all in on the 3 guys we just talked about. I will be taking a shot in each of my lineups. I'm going to be taking a shot at a guy who can dominate the race because 3 of the last 4 years at Auto Club Speedway, we've had one driver lead more than half the race. And if that happens, that's 25 points right there just from laps led. Of course, he'll get some fastest laps, he'll get points for finishing position, wherever he ends up finishing. So I am taking a Dominator shot in every single 3 max. I am mixing and matching Johnson, Bain, and Logano. I won't say in what proportions. I probably hinted at it with who I'm fading, but I won't exactly say in what proportions. But I'm most inclined to, of course, mix and match them because I don't think it's likely all 3 will be in the winning lineup. So that's kind of my strategy there, is to mix and match them.
So one thing, I guess actually 2 things. So one, what happens at the higher stakes level in a 3 entry max, I think is very different than what would happen in the lower stakes in terms of what would be optimal for game theory and things like that. But then secondly, I'd like your input on this. How do you think that the segmentation for this race is going to impact the potential dominator dynamics that we see?
Yeah, so that's actually, I'm going to talk about the stakes dynamic there first. Yeah, I think in the lower stakes 3 max or whatever, I don't think the theory changes a ton. It does. It certainly changes because I think in the higher stakes, I think people will be more inclined to go with the safe drivers because the field is smaller. There's only 100, I think, in the 333, but in the really large 3 max, there's still 20,000 or 15,000 or 10,000 people entering. So I'm still inclined to go opposite of what I think people will be doing, which I think in that case, you still don't want to hammer all 3 of them in the same lineup is my personal impression. I think there'd be too many lineups with all 3 of them. So I'd be certainly most inclined to fade lineups of building all 3 of Johnson, Logano, and Bane in my 3-entry max. Now, does that mean you should mix or match them, go all in on one? That's totally up to you. Like I said, I personally like fading Jimmy Johnson relative to, I think, what he'll be owned. Obviously, there is a little price discount for him compared to Logano. So the fact that he's maybe only 15th or 12th type best driver versus Logano maybe being a top 5 or top 6 driver, well, that's still a 12-point difference for only I think it's a $600 or $500 salary difference. So that's more than a 1x increase in price, or in value. So I would still lean towards Logano.
All right, and then you said you're going to talk a little bit about the Dominator segmentation.
Yeah. Sorry. So thanks for money. So I think with Auto Club Speedway, we have a lot of cautions. It is the track that we've seen the 4th most cautions among the 23 tracks in NASCAR in terms of percentage of laps run since 2013, which is when they introduced the Gen 6 car. Now, obviously, they made modifications to the Gen 6 car, but I still think it's pretty relevant because that's when the track surface has been very old at Auto Club Speedway. So looking back, 3 of the last 4 years, we still have had a Dominator that's led over 50% of the laps. So the fact that we have these segments now, all it's going to do is add 2 more official caution periods, right? But I don't think it's going to change the fact that we see a lot of cautions at this place, and yet there still has been a Dominator. So could it? I certainly think it could. We saw it at Phoenix. We saw that definitely change the dynamic there. But I don't think it's a guarantee. I think maybe instead of 75% chance of there being a major Dominator, maybe there's like a 60% chance or something like that.
All right, we have 2 different questions about Greg Galdin, which means that it's like a true degenerate group that we have watching the show. But so one of them, how heavy are you on Greg Galdin? He starts dead last in salary and also on the track, but he hasn't finished races this season. Does he have any survival upside?
Yeah, he has survival ability. I don't think it's like, the massive survival ability of all of these other guys, but if he just stays in the race, the fact that people will have problems, we saw it in practice. People got into the wall because of tire issues. We saw it, just so many tire issues in the nationwide, or so the Xfinity race, for example. So, I think certainly it's possible Greg Galdin is in the winning lineup. So I have, I think maybe about 10 to 15% exposure to Greg Galdin. I think he's a really great play because he practiced much faster than he actually qualified. He was one of the drivers that didn't get to qualify. But he practiced 32nd best on the single lap. He didn't take a 10-lap average, but he did practice 32nd best on the single lap, and he starts 39th. That $4,500 salary is really forgiving. It does let you jam in Logano and Johnson and maybe somebody like a Harvick, Kyle Busch, Truex, Keselowski, one of those drivers to potentially get some Dominator points, or even do some funny things like play 4 expensive drivers. So maybe you go Kyle Larson, who's on the pole, right? And if he has the potential to dominate, he won the Xfinity race yesterday. So then you can maybe do something like a Larson, Elliott, Johnson, Logano type lineup with a Galdin, and maybe you can fit Bane. I haven't looked at the exact salaries as I'm kind of just shooting from the hip, but certainly Greg Galdin is in play in GPPs, and the NASCAR optimizer that we have at RotoViz, rotoviz.com/NASCAR-optimizer, Greg Galdin is in the optimal lineup.
That's a little scary there. So actually, you just mentioned Larson winning the Xfinity race yesterday. Obviously, that was after we had recorded the podcast. Does that change? I should just say, in the podcast, you were a little bit towards the fading side. Does that change the Xfinity win? Does that change your opinion on him or the way that you might perceive him for this race?
No, I think in GPPs I'm still underweight on him. There's a lot of strong cars in the Cup Series compared to the Xfinity Series. There's only a handful of drivers that can dominate a race in the Xfinity Series. Logano, Kyle Busch, Kyle Larson was basically it yesterday. Now there's all those three guys plus a whole bunch more. Truex, Keselowski, any of these, Chase Elliott, for example, Kyle Busch. So, all right, we already mentioned him, but you get the point. So there's a lot more Kevin Harvick drivers that can dominate this race. So I think Kyle Larson is going to be too highly owned compared to what I think the probability he is that he dominates enough of the race. Because remember, he starts first, and there's only 200 laps. It's not like there's 312 like there was last week at Phoenix. And we get a lot of cautions in this race. So there's less fastest laps points available. So he really needs to dominate and have a solid, maybe top 6-7 finish for him to be in the winning lineup. If he doesn't dominate enough, if he only leads 25, 30 laps, yeah, he'll get some fastest laps. But if he doesn't do that and then finish top 2 or 3, he's not going to be in the winning lineup. So I think he'll probably be, 30, 35% owned. I'm going to be about 20, 25% on him.
Okay, so we have an interesting question here. Is there any positive EV for 3 or 5 pit crews that excel, not strategy, but physical tasks that might shave X seconds?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So, is there any benefit to going with particular pit crews that seem to have an edge, not necessarily a strategic edge, but right, just like in their physical ability to change tires quickly or whatever?
Yeah, I think there is. I think certainly, Denny Hamlin's pit crew is great. Hamlin starts second. He didn't practice very well at all, so I'm not playing him much, if any. But if it comes down to that, they've got a great pit crew. Denny Hamlin is really good on restarts. He doesn't have the best longest run car by any means, but just in general, he goes like balls to the wall on those first few laps. That's kind of his philosophy. So maybe somebody like him, I would be, certainly with a lot of cautions, that means we could fade somebody like Kevin Harvick, who seems to have a really wide range of outcomes in his pit stops. They're either like the fastest or they totally screw something up. Denny Hamlin does speed on pit road a lot too. So I think Harvick and Hamlin both have really wide ranges of outcomes on their pit stops. With so many cautions, there's also a lot of potential for just, pit penalties. So it's just going to be a crazy race. I think, I don't know if there's a huge strategic advantage. Obviously, the Penske guys are always fast. Maybe that gives Logano an edge. I don't know if there's a massive edge in pit crews, but I think certainly maybe somebody like Logano or Keselowski could benefit from that. I did talk about the wide range of outcomes for Harvick and Hamlin. But I think there's more downside, especially for Harvick, with a lot of pit stops because his crew has been prone to having problems on pit stops. So those are the ones that come to mind. Johnson's pit crew hasn't been the fastest as of late. Again, of those drivers coming from the back to the front, just another reason that I like being a little underweight on Johnson compared to the field.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you touched on this a little bit, but here's a question. Statistically speaking, isn't there a good chance that one of the 3 chalk plays has a tire issue today? So the question is, does that make them fade worthy in GPP? And you've answered that, but can you talk a little bit more about the tire issues that we are likely to see at Auto Club?
Certainly. So just to answer the question, yes. Obviously, there's a very good chance that one of the 3 at least encounters a problem, whether it's a tire issue or something else. So as far as the tire issues go, Auto Club Speedway hasn't been repaved in 20, 21 years, something like that. So it's really old. It's abrasive. It's bumpy. There's seams in the track. There's actually there's seams in the road like you might see at certain highways or something like that. And so you don't want to get on those seams. But the idea is it's so abrasive that these tires wear down extremely quickly. You maybe get 1 or 2 good laps out of these tires, and that's it. Even 2 tires for a car that is just changed 2 tires versus another car that is on no tires, but only has run 2 laps on those 4 tires, like even the 2 tires will still be beneficial over 4 tires that are only 2 laps old. So it's that's how important it is. You can lose 2 seconds a lap or more after just like a handful of laps to somebody who has 4 fresh tires. So they're just so abrasive. And then not only do you have a lot of tire wear, but unlike Atlanta, where we didn't see a lot of blows or punctures or different things like that, there does, for whatever reason, seem to be much more of that at Auto Club. I think part of it might be the fact that it's 2 miles instead of 1.5 miles. It could just be some other things like maybe just the concrete itself is the asphalt itself is just a little different in the way it rubs the tires. But certainly we will see a lot of tire issues today. We've seen it every year for the past 3 or 4 years, and that's just the nature of the beast at Auto Club.
All right, so next question. Someone participates in only 10 contests. I'm assuming these are more GPPs as opposed to cash games. But I have different ways to think about that. Should I go with 48 and 22 in all my lineups with the number 6 sprinkled in? So I think the answer there is probably not. You talked about that, but go ahead and address it a little bit. I guess the question is, like, given that they play in limited GPPs as opposed to sort of like spreading it around all the GPPs, how do you approach that? Do you have more of a leveraged approach where you're going with all of those 3 chalky guys, or do you still diversify?
So if you only have 10 entries, and it really depends on how much caching matters to you. If it's really important that you cache, I think it's okay to go 100% on all 3 of them. That said, it's very likely one of the 3 will have a problem, and if everybody has those, you're not benefiting from being different on one of them. So you still might not cache, even if you do have all 3 and none of them encounter problems, because if so many people have all 3 of them. So I think diversification is the way to go, even if you're doing 10 entries, especially if you want to have a chance at winning, a GPP or finishing really high, maybe 5, 6, 7, 10x your entry. You're going to want to diversify because it is most likely that at least one of the 3 will have a problem. So, like I said, maybe it's about a 30% chance. What if you did, only 3 of your lineups with all 3 of them? I think that probably makes the most sense.
All right. We have a 2v2, Bain, Blaney versus Johnson and Matty Benedetto.
Bain and Blaney. Trevor Bain and Blaney versus Johnson and DiBenedetto. Ooh, that's a good one. So Trevor Bain starts right back there in 36th, I think it is. And Ryan Blaney starts 19th. He was super fast in practice, single lap, 10 lap average. He's looked really good this weekend. Gosh, that's tough. I think for diversification, I would go with Blaney and Bain. But I don't mind Johnson and DiBenedetto either. I think both are solid plays. I just think the upside is probably a little higher with Bain and Blaney because I don't think, while DiBenedetto is very safe, I think the Johnson and DiBenedetto combination have lower upside, as I talked about the limitations there with Johnson. And there certainly is limitations with DiBenedetto. Yes, he's going to come from 38th to 30th, 29th, 28th, depending on the number of cars that fall out, but I don't expect him to get inside the top 24, let's say. So there's much more limited upside with Johnson and DiBenedetto.
Can you talk a little bit about Blaney starting 19th and your general approach to guys who are starting in kind of that middle range and like how you like to use them?
Yeah, so I think the guys that are starting in that mid-range are interesting because in races where we like dominators, they're not close enough to the front to be dominators, but they're not far enough back to have like massive place differential. But with those guys in the middle, they make really great GPP plays because they tend to be under-owned. Now, what I really like doing is using a super cheap guy in that mid-range because typically we want our cheaper guys to start a little further back. Now, Blaney isn't super cheap. He's at $8,300, so he's basically right around the average salary per driver, right? $8,333 is an average salary for a driver. So he's right there around average. He starts basically in an average starting position, but he's just been so good in practice. So I think a really good way to diversify this week would be to pick 1 or 2 of those drivers starting way in the back that we talked about. And then maybe going up towards like an Erik Almirola. That's a great pivot off of Trevor Bain, for example. Almirola starts 31st. He looked good in practice. And then using 1 or 2 of those drivers that start 19th, like Blaney, or 18th, like Dale Jr. Maybe maybe 15th like Kurt Busch. Kurt Busch didn't practice great, but the thing I do like about Kurt Busch this week, and I don't have a ton of them, and I kind of feel bad that I'm saying this because I don't have a ton of them, but I think the good thing about Kurt Busch is he's going to be so low owned. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to use him because he didn't practice that great, and he's in that 15th starting position. He's a little expensive, like 8,600 or somewhere around there. But if we get a lot of restarts, especially towards the end of the race, Kurt Busch is the restart master. So, if he can be really good on a couple of those single laps, he has a chance to be, I think, a better chance to be in the winning lineup than I think he will be owned. So it's really all about just playing the probabilities of what are they going to be in the winning lineup versus what is their ownership percentage. And now that I have said all this, I'm going to try to find ways to get a little bit more exposure to Kurt Busch.
All right. Here's the question. So there's going to be the question, and then I'm going to ask a sort of meta question on this. So the question is it smart to differentiate and play drivers who are less aggressive / more likely to avoid tire wear and problems? And he specifically says, I'm thinking of Danica types. So that's the question. And then my sort of meta question on this is that the assumption there that someone is more likely to avoid tire wear and problems because they are driving less aggressively. Is that a true assumption? Like, is there a link between those two things?
Anecdotally, there's probably a tiny link between the two. Certainly, if you drive more aggressively, you're going to be harder on the tires. But a lot of it depends on the setup of the car. Cars that are driving bad, you're just going to need to work them harder in general. So, drivers that have really bad practice times or have been struggling with the setup, they're loose or they're tight or whatever, they're going to abuse their tires much more. And another thing that could, even if you have a car that's handling perfectly, it also depends on how you set the car up. The thing that affects blowing tires is two things. One is the air pressure in the tire. So teams will run below Goodyear's recommendation sometimes. Goodyear will say you have to run at least this PSI or higher to really be on the safe side about not having blown tires. Well, teams, of course, want every edge they can get. Less air pressure. Bit of
deflate gate.
Yeah, exactly. Some deflate gate. So, if they run lower air pressure than what Goodyear recommends, they get better contact in the corners. They can corner better. And the other thing is camber. And camber is the angle at which you run your tire. So instead of being straight up, you're going to tilt your tire like this so that in the corner, when there's banking, your tire is making the most contact possible with the racing surface. So it's perfectly aligned with the banking, or at least not perfectly, but much more aligned. So on the straightaway, you're driving on an edge of your tire, and that's going to wear that specific part of the tire much more. And that over-cambering can also lead to blown tires. So the combination of camber and low air pressure certainly leads to a lot of tire issues, and that can be independent of how aggressive you are.
Good. It's been maybe a year since I've heard you say the word camber. I knew it had to take the right question to get it out of you.
Yeah, exactly. And I should mention, instead of Budweiser, we're drinking some Black Butte Porter. So I went with my classy side this week.
Okay, there we go.
It's still a 10:30 a.m. beer, though.
All right. Okay, next question. Who's the best GPP driver under 6.7 thousand besides Almirola?
Under 6.7 besides Almirola, the best GPP driver? Whew, that's a tough one. I actually I might say this is I think there's a lot of good GPP drivers. It depends, like if you're trying to get as many points as you can, then it's different than which is the best GPP play, because obviously if you drop really far down in salary, like I said, to somebody like Galdin, Corey LaJoie, Di Benedetto, for example, you can then use higher salary drivers. So I'm going to approach this two ways. The first way is there is a ton of them because it depends on what you want to do with your roster. The second way is if you're just trying to find the driver that scores the most points or has the highest upside in terms of raw points, 6,700 or less, it's probably Allmendinger. But if we then take ownership percentage into account, I kind of like Danica Patrick and Ty Dillon. Those would probably be my two favorites because I think Allmendinger will be more highly owned than Danica and Ty. I've gotten a lot of questions on Twitter about can we use Allmendinger in cash, and when I get that means he's probably going to be pretty highly owned relative to Ty Dillon and Danica Patrick. And I think Allmendinger isn't exactly enamored with his car. Yes, he's good on restarts, but he's not exactly enamored with his car. So I think he could be one of those guys that might pop a tire, for example. So Danica and Ty Dillon, I think. Ty Dillon also really has very much struggled with his car. He didn't make a 10 lap run in practice. So when that happens, you're not happy with your car. The drivers that did that are Dale Jr., Ricky Stenhouse, and Ty Dillon. Now, Dale Jr. says he was very happy, not very, but he was much more happy with his car at the end of the session. They just didn't get a chance to make a 10-lap run because they weren't happy with it up until the end of the session. But certainly Ricky Stenhouse wasn't happy with his car. I'm fading him completely. Ty Dillon, I think versus Ty Dillon and Danica Patrick, I think Ty Dillon's a better driver. I think Danica Patrick could even be lower owned than Ty. And I think Danica Patrick also will probably just be low owned, is more happy with her car. So that would probably give her less probability of having a blown tire. So to answer the question, finally, I think Allmendinger has the highest upside for points, but I like Danica Patrick as my favorite game theory GPP play.
All right. Next question, DiBenedetto and Truex versus Larson and Buescher.
DiBenedetto, Truex, Larson, Buescher. I'm going to go DiBenedetto, Truex. I think Buescher has a lot of downside, not much upside. He didn't practice well at all. I did talk about him on the podcast, but then, we always record that before practice times come out, and Buescher was slow in final practice. 29th on the single lap, 27th on the 10-lap average. Yeah, he went later in the session, but that doesn't make many spots up for him. I just think that 20th starting position, probably too high for him relative to what he's been practicing. So I'm going to go with the Truex and the DiBenedetto combo. I think Truex has a very good chance to dominate a portion of this race, so I like that upside as well. Larson also, I think, will be much higher owned than Truex, so I like it from a game theory perspective as well.
Okay, we are getting a ton of Galdin questions. What do you think his ownership is going to be?
I don't know, 15%. I think in the higher stakes, it could be maybe more than that, but I think 15%, maybe 20% is probably pushing it in the lower stakes tournaments. I think in the higher stakes tournaments, he could be around 20 to 25.
Why is that exactly?
He starts dead last. He starts dead last. He's the cheapest. We're going to probably have 8, 10, 12 drivers that encounter problems. And if he's not one of them, if he literally just drives a little bit safe and doesn't have a blown tire like everybody else does and just finishes on, even 2 or 3 laps down, it's not a big deal. 5 laps down, it's not a big deal if 10 other guys fall out. So that if he gets that 30th, 29th, 28th place finishing position at $4,500, let's say he finishes 30th. That's 9 place differential points, and that's 14 points for finishing position. That's 23 points. That's that's like 5x, and a 5x from a min salary driver allows you to get somebody who could potentially dominate the race into your lineup. A guy like I said, like Harvick or Truex or Kyle Busch, in addition to those Logano's and Johnsons.
Okay, so it seems like what you said doesn't make him like an automatic play in cash, but it seems like he's a pretty decent play in cash. And so but then the question is, if you already know you're going with the 3 chalky guys and then you're locking in Galdin, what are you going to do with those other 2 drivers? It seems like so many people would end up with very comparable lineups, if not identical lineups. I
would say yes, that's normally the case, but the number one question I've gotten the most in cash games about cash games is Allmendinger versus DiBenedetto. And I'm like, how are you asking me a question where it's a one-on-one versus a guy who's 6,600 versus a guy who's 57 or 5,500? So people are considering leaving over $1,000 left on the table, and it's the most popular question I've got about cash games is Allmendinger versus DiBenedetto. So there's certainly a very 5 drivers that I think a lot of people are using, and then have a 1v1 versus Allmendinger and DiBenedetto. And that's not a Galdin lineup, so I can guarantee that. So I'm just going to build it now. I'm going to put Galdin, Logano, Johnson, Bain, and then let's see what else we can do. So that leaves us with $9,100 per driver if we do that. Obviously, Kyle Larson's right at $9,100.
Yeah.
But then you can't really get another Dominator. So I don't love this roster construction from a cash game perspective. So I actually think it'd be kind of different. I think one thing you could do, if you think maybe somebody like Chase Elliott will dominate, you can go Chase Elliott and Ryan Blaney or Denny Hamlin if you think Denny Hamlin might get the early jump on Larson. But I don't like Denny Hamlin at all this week. But then you're making a lineup that has no Dominators unless somehow Chase Elliott dominates, which he very well could. But then you're making a cash game lineup that guarantees you don't have any Dominators unless, like I said, Logano or Johnson or Elliott somehow get out front. But you're really banking on them for place differential and hoping one of them dominates. So it's a weird lineup. I think because of that, a lot more people are going away from Galdin, and they're going more like, Kyle Larson, and I bet Erik Almirola would be my guess if for this roster construction. And that leaves you 7,100. I guess maybe that lets you choose between Dinger and DiBenedetto. I'm not quite sure what people are doing with that lineup. Maybe they're going Chase Elliott or something, but so maybe they're going Chase instead of Larson, which again, then you're going with a all-place differential lineup. And so it looks like Chase Elliott and Almirola with the big three. Then you have 6,600, so you can either go with Allmendinger and DiBenedetto. I think that's the lineup everybody's using. So I'm not using that as my cash game lineup. I'll just say that right now, but I think I figured out the lineup that everybody is using.
Right. So, I mean, that might not be the lineup to use. I mean,
in cash games, I think that's a good point. In cash games, that might not be the lineup to use because that's what everybody is using. Yeah. So, if something were to happen, let's say to AJ Allmendinger or Matt DiBenedetto, right? Like that just screws all of those people's lineups. And again, there's no Dominator in that lineup. So we could go the no Dominator route and do what I just talked about. Go with Galdin and then maybe like a Chase Elliott and Ryan Blaney or something. So there's a lot of different ways you can go in cash games. That might be a great pivot lineup off of the lineup I think everybody else is going to use. Now, it's just totally dependent on what you want to do. If you want to go with if you really want to make sure you get a Dominator, if you think the race will have a Dominator, you could go something like Larson and Truex and just guarantee probably that you get a bunch of those early Dominator points. I think maybe you could go Keselowski, but he hasn't practiced as fast as Truex, both in the single lap and the 10 lap. Truex had the second fastest single, fastest 10 lap. So if you go like Larson Truex type cash game lineup, you might guarantee yourself that you get, let's say, 50% of the laps led, and that might be a way to go. So there's a lot of ways to go in cash games, even though there is this big three of chalk. So it really comes down to which of all these different options is going to be the optimal way to go. There's definitely less edge in cash this week than most weeks because I think there's probably 3 or 4 main roster constructions that people will be using.
Right. All right. So 2v2, DiBenedetto and Bowyer versus Galdin and Blaney.
DiBenedetto and Bowyer versus Galdin and Blaney. Let me look at Clint Bowyer here. I don't hate Clint Bowyer, but, he practiced 23rd on the single lap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11th on the 10 lap average, but 10 lap, for whatever reason, seems to be less predictive of finishing position than single lap. And I think that might be because we get a lot of restarts. So the drivers that are better on one lap, especially late restarts, the drivers that are better on one lap are do better than the drivers that are better over the long run. So I'm more inclined to go with the non-Bowyer option, whatever that ended up being.
All right, that would be Galdin and Blaney.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I love Blaney. He's fast both on the single lap and the 10 lap run.
All right, next question has to do with Erik Jones. Why does your model, and then I'll add this in, and you personally seem to dislike him?
I love Erik Jones, actually. We haven't talked about him. So I don't know who said I dislike Erik Jones. I love Erik Jones this week. I don't know why the model doesn't. I think it's probably because he doesn't have a great finishing position at this track, or not at this track, at the track type. So the 3 things that went in the model are year-to-date fastest laps, final lap or final practice single lap speed, and type finishing position, recent track type finishing position, like over the last 8-10 large oval races. So I think it's his finishing position. If I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think it's that. He certainly practiced very well. He is a really sneaky play in GPPs. I have a decent amount of Erik Jones, so my model doesn't. I love him. I don't know where the notion came that I don't love him this week.
All right. I think this is a good question. Do you think one Dominator in 5 plays
Oh, I think you froze, Matt.
Oh, can you? Am I here?
It says my internet connection is unstable. That's not good.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Maybe.
Okay, we don't want me answering the questions.
All right, Nick, we're back. We're back.
All right, good. Okay.
So ask that again.
Yeah. So do you think that one Dominator and 5 place differential guys is a good strategy for tournaments?
Yes.
For this race specifically. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a fine strategy. And it depends on what you mean by place differential. I think something like let's say you go a Truex, who could be a Dominator, and Chase Elliott, who starts 13th and has a chance to get 10, 12 place differential. I think that counts. Like that, you might not think of Chase Elliott as a place differential guy, but 12 place differential and winning the race will get you in the winning lineup, right? So even if he doesn't dominate, even if he only leads the last lap, that will put him in the winning lineup. So yes, I think 1 Dominator and 5 place differential. Drivers starting, beyond like 12th, I think, count as place differential, depending on what their potential is for finishing. So place differential matters relative to what your finishing upside is. So, Trevor Bayne is a place differential guy. I wouldn't say he's a place differential guy if he starts in 13th, because I don't think he has the chance to finish top 5 or 6, but which is what he would need in his salary. But Chase Elliott in 13th has the potential to win, which would more than make up for his salary. And so 46 points for the win plus 12 place differential points guarantees 58 points. He'll definitely get a lap lead, a couple fastest laps. I would put him over 60 points and definitely in the winning lineup. So to answer the question, I think 1 Dominator, 5 place differential is probably the most optimal roster construction. That said, it's not out of the realm of possibility that 6 place differential could win it. Maybe somebody like Chase Elliott ends up dominating a portion of the race, or even Logano or Johnson could end up dominating a portion of the race, especially with the extra cautions we get from the segments. So certainly a possibility.
Mm-hmm. So much Di Benedetto and Galdin in terms of like the questions that people are asking, but so someone's asking, is it viable in GPP to have both Di Benedetto and Galdin?
That is certainly viable. I think I don't know what you would do with that lineup. I mean, I guess you're just jamming in like the most expensive drivers, which so you're not playing Trevor Bayne in that lineup. So you're playing Logano and Johnson, and then you're probably playing like a Larson and a Harvick or something, which I think doesn't make sense if you're playing both Larson and Harvick because they both start so far forward. You're probably going to want 1 Dominator, not 2. And so I'm not sure I love this roster construction. Maybe you go like Chase Elliott and I don't know, somebody, but that's kind of what you're doing. So I think it's viable. I just don't necessarily know if I love the roster construction itself. Because, I guess you're banking there on like maybe Truex or Keselowski dominating or Chase Elliott dominating or something like that. I just don't think it's necessary. I don't think that's going to be the winning construction. Is it viable? Yeah, it could be the winning construction. I just don't think that's the way to go. Now, we have talked a lot about Galdin and Di Benedetto, so I kind of want to go off of asking or answering some questions for a bit. But Corey LaJoie starts 30th, and he's only $2,000 more than Galdin. So what if Galdin has a problem and LaJoie is the guy that that ends up being in the winning lineup or something like that? He's going to be like 2, 5, 7% owned tops, and I think that's. I think the nature of the beast with these back marker guys is that you don't want to go too chalky on them because they certainly have a high probability of just like parking it because a piece of their car broke, right? So like LaJoie starts behind Reed Sorensen, he starts behind Colt Witt, he starts behind David Reagan. I think he can pass all of those drivers. Certainly it's possible maybe a guy like Landon Castle starting in 26th just survives and advances. Maybe 5 or 6 drivers or 8 drivers in front of him don't finish, and so Castle finishes 18th, right? I think he's a guy that will go far under owned. So we talk about a lot of these back markers as if it has to be Galdin or Di Benedetto, and yes, it's probably most likely those two, but with the nature of the beast here at Auto Club, with the amount of DNFs we get, with the fact that back marker cars just tend to be more unreliable, I like going overweight on maybe guys like Castle or McDowell or Corey LaJoie, different things like that.
Okay. I like this question. Dark horse dominator.
I think my dark horse dominator is probably Truex. I think more people will be inclined to use a guy like Chase Elliott or Kyle Busch. Obviously people will think of Kyle Larson, maybe Brad Keselowski. Denny Hamlin starts second, so people like to use that guy that starts second. It's just a thing that people do. And I think it'll probably be Truex as the dark horse dominator.
All right, so you just talked about Truex. You've mentioned Chase Elliott. Out of those two, who do you prefer in cash? And would you use either of them in cash?
Damn, that's a good question. I like using both of them in cash in some ways because I think, those two drivers are so they were 1 and 2 in the single lap, and they were 2 and 1 in the 10 lap. So like those are the two dominant cars from practice times. So I don't mind a roster construction where you jam both of them into a cash game lineup. Now, what happens if you do that? Then, if you're looking at Chase and Truex and Logano and Johnson and Bain, what does that leave you? That leaves you 3,700. So you can't do the 3 plus the 2 and have a actual usable lineup. So you're going to have to make some decisions there. Do you forego Bain and maybe drop down to, you can't even drop down Almirola because that's only 4,400 and Galdin is 4,500. So,
I think you cut out Johnson.
Yeah, maybe you cut out Johnson. I don't know. Or maybe you cut out Logano since he's more expensive. But that's certainly a tough avenue to go in terms of this cash game roster construction. So, I mean, yeah, what if we cut out Johnson, then we go Almirola and Bain, and we have 7,000. That's like such an awkward number. Like, I guess we could do Allmendinger again. So, yeah, it's a possible roster construction. Does it guarantee you're going to hit a Dominator? No, because it's just such a weird... Truex and Elliott, yeah, they could dominate, but Truex starts 4th, Elliott starts 13th, so Elliott is not like extremely likely to dominate a large chunk of the race, but he doesn't have to if he finishes top 2 or 3 and has a handful of Dominator points. Truex, you're banking on him for Dominator points and hoping he doesn't pop a tire. So the safest roster construction, of course, is the no Dominator roster construction, but like, it would just be really interesting if somebody went like Larson and Truex and like basically locked up some Dominator points or what even. I mean, I don't think this is I might throw it in just to see what happens in like 1 or 2 like smaller 50-50s or something like that. But like, what if I go like Truex, Larson, and Elliott, the 3 drivers I think are most likely to dominate, and basically just lock down the Dominator points, and then go with like a Galding, and maybe I'll pick Logano. And then that leaves us 7,100. I could do Bain instead and Johnson, and I think that's so I forego Logano, and then I have Johnson and Bain in Galding, and then 3 drivers that I think could dominate. They're probably the 3 best drivers of the race. So I think that's an interesting way to go. I might throw that in a couple double ups.
All right, so you just mentioned the possibility of going with Truex and Larson to lock up Dominator. Someone is asking Truex or Larson in cash.
Truex or Larson in cash. I'm more inclined to go with Truex. I think, I think just from an ownership percentage perspective and the likelihood that the 2 dominate, it's probably about equal. I mean, I guess there's a slight nod to Larson. Certainly because he has the pit stop advantage. There's going to be a lot of pit stops, and he's great at this track. But he didn't quite practice as fast. He still practiced very fast. But I just think with the probability that things happen at this track, and the relative ownership percentages, and this is like one of the rare times I'm considering ownership percentage in cash games, I think Truex is probably the more positive EV play in the long run. That said, it's really close between the 2. I just like maybe I'm just, I'm certainly doing it different this week than I think a lot of people will be. I think Larson is the safer play, but I think ownership percentage relative, he'll be much higher than Truex. And at a track where things happen, I would rather go with Truex as my cash game play versus Larson.
Okay, this is a good question, and I have to say, I think the questions that have more to do with sort of like strategy and how it is that you manipulate some of the, or how you calculate things or manipulate some of the tools, I think those are really good questions. Not that the questions of like these 2 guys versus those 2 guys, not that those aren't good questions, but anyway, so how are you able to figure out the probabilities for DNFs and the chance that a driver is going to do well?
There's 2 main things I do. I look at the historical DNF rate of the track, the recent historical. So like since the Gen 6 car, which is 2013, then at Auto Club, the DNF rate is about 1 out of every 6 drivers. So that's just the generic DNF rate. Certainly there are drivers that are more reliable than others just because they're in better equipment. So better equipment helps you be more reliable. But also aggressiveness or propensity just to crash. Like we always talk about Recce Stenhouse. There are things that certain drivers are just more susceptible to having problems. For example, Denny Hamlin is more susceptible to pit road problems than any other driver on the series, I think. So there's just things like that can, while it doesn't increase your probability of DNFing, it decreases your probability of being in the winning lineup. So I start with the historical track rate, and then I make some adjustments based off of certain factors, the reliability of the driver, and things like that. Then the final thing I do is I can also build a statistical model, and say, what is the probability a driver finishes or doesn't finish? And so I have different ways of doing that, and basically, like, it's not that reliable. So even though it's a machine learning model, it's just like predicting DNFs is so hard. So like the fit of that model is basically as good as predicting who's going to lead the most laps. It's pretty tough, especially at this track. So like the R squared, or the I guess logistic regression equivalent of an R squared is about the same as like the probability of predicting all of the drivers' laps led combined.
All right, so you mentioned earlier that you like Erik Jones. I think you've also talked about Blaney versus Jones.
Blaney. I think it's close between the two. Obviously, there's a $600 price difference. There is a 5 starting spot difference in qualifying position. Blaney 19th, Erik Jones 14th. So it's really close. I think I just prefer a little more upside with Blaney in the fact that he has a little bit more experience. He was third versus Erik Jones, fourth in the single lap. Erik Jones was fourth in the 10 lap. Blaney was sixth. They're like neck and neck. I think if you're doing a 1v1 versus those two, there's just a bit more upside with Blaney, just because he has 5 more place differential points potential.
All right, so I'm going to build on this question. This question is, do you think Harvick goes under-owned, and do you like him today? And it's interesting that we haven't mentioned Harvick. Last week it was Phoenix, right? Last week was Phoenix, or am I like missing weeks in there somewhere? Right? Was last week Phoenix?
Yeah, last week was Phoenix.
Yeah, last week was Phoenix. So it should have been sort of like Kevin Harvick day, and it wasn't. Do you think there's the possibility that because of the sort of like the relative underperformance to expectations that we saw with Harvick last week, he goes a little bit under-owned this week?
Yes, definitely. And I think his price tag, and I think the fact that we've got Johnson and Logano starting so far back, the fact that people will pick, Larson or Truex or Kyle Busch as potential dominators, Harvick's going to be super under-owned. Here's Harvick's record at California over the last several years. Second, 36, which of course is a problem. 13th, and then 4th, 1st, 2nd. So you get the idea. He's usually a top 2 or 3 driver here at California. So I think it's certainly the probability that he has a day where he can dominate or wins or things like that is going to be higher than his ownership percentage. So I'm trying to get as much Harvick exposure as I can. I've been finding it pretty hard, just like everybody else has, because it's so comfortable to use Johnson and Logano, and then I like other dominators more. So, like I talked about, Chase Elliott, Kyle Busch, Truex, for example. So certainly I'm probably like the rest of the field and not using enough Harvick.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have Harvick at 7, so he obviously doesn't have quite the dominating potential of Larson or Truex, who are starting ahead, but he doesn't have the place differential benefit of someone like Chase Elliott starting at 13. So he's in a little bit of an awkward spot there.
Yeah, and he's definitely in the most awkward spot, because you want him. I mean, to use him, you need him to dominate the race, and then or dominate just a very small portion of the race, but win. That's the way he's going to be in the winning lineup. Now, what's the probability that happens? I don't know, maybe 15%, 20%. What's he going to be owned? Maybe it's 10, 15%. I honestly think he could be that low this week. I think he could be extremely low owned, just because of how high owned Johnson, Logano are going to be. Plus, then you've got a whole bunch of other guys in that expensive price range that you compare with Johnson and Logano to potentially dominate. And Harvick is in that most awkward starting spot. But like I said, I mean, he has a great track record here. He can dominate, certainly. So, a really good game theory play would be to go like 25% on him, because I don't think he's going to be 25% owned, as crazy as it sounds, with the way just qualifying worked out this week. I think a really good game theory play, like I said, is an exploitative strategy. It's probably not GTO. I think GTO is probably maybe 15%, and that's also probably equal weight to the field, or 20%. But I think a little exploitative, if you want to bank on the route that Harvick does end up dominating and or winning, doing enough, 25% is probably a good way to go. I wouldn't go much more than 30%, because certainly it's a pretty low probability that he's in the winning lineup. But I think it's right around where I'd expect him to be in terms of probability of winning lineup and his ownership percentage.
You talked a little bit about Bowyer earlier. Someone's considering him in cash. What do you think about that?
No. No. Don't do it. That's not a viable option there.
Yeah. Someone says, who's your favorite GPP driver under 10.2 thousand?
Favorite GPP driver under 10.2. Let me go look at the salaries here real quick. 1 second. Probably Truex. It could be Chase or Truex. I think are my two favorite GPP plays. But there's a lot. Again, favorite. I think Almirola is one of my favorite plays. He's under 10.2, right? It depends on what your question is. Is it probability of being in the winning lineup, or is it highest number of points scored? It really depends. But I think in that price range of the expensive ones, it's Truex or Elliott.
All right, 3 more questions. I think these are good questions, so good ones to end the show on. Is this week a contrarian's dream or worst nightmare?
I think it's a contrarian's dream. I think Bain, Logano, Johnson will probably be too high owned compared to their probability of all being in the winning lineup. So, if you just mix and match 2 of them, even occasionally one of them, I think that's going to be an advantage on the field. And so, I've gotten so many people telling me on Twitter that they're having a hard time getting away from those 3. They think it's a chalky week, but shit happens at Auto Club Speedway. Like, shit happens. So I think it's a contrarian's dream.
Mm-hmm. How much salary are you comfortable leaving on the table in GPPs this week? I think this is a great question.
That's a really good question. I'm comfortable leaving maybe like 1,300, 1,500. I think that's certainly possible. You can have a lineup with a DiBenedetto and the Almirola, forgo Bain, maybe use Johnson and Logano as your 2 guys, but then go with some more middling drivers like a Blaney and a Truex or something, and that's probably going to leave you. I didn't do the calculations just off the top of my head. That might leave you like $1,000 on the table or something. So certainly possible. The winning lineup is, I would say, maybe 48,500 or higher, but I don't think more than 1,500 is necessary.
All right, and then final question here. Do you notice that the winner of the Xfinity race the day before has an elevated ownership the next day as in comparison to what you maybe would have anticipated?
I haven't noticed that. It doesn't mean it's not there. I just haven't looked for it. I think that's actually a really good question. Something I should look back and try to see if that is a statistically significant, part of a model, because that's a really good point. Is people pay attention to who won yesterday, and that was Larson. So maybe he's elevated in ownership percentage because of that. I haven't noticed it, but that's because I haven't looked for it. And that's a really good thing to include in a model if it's significant. So I'm going to go back and dig through that data and see if it ends up being significant.
Good. Make a note of that, Nick. I expect a report next week.
Yep, I will put out a report, and you can be my grader on that. Wait, no, I'm done with school, man. I'm freaking done with school. I'm never going to school again. No reports.
It's not like a report you're going to be graded on. It's whether we're going to fire you.
Okay. Wait. Hold on. I think I'm in charge here.
Yeah, I'm going to fire you from the NASCAR team at RotoViz. I'm going to take it over.
Talk about being contrarian. I think that might be the most contrarian move.
Yeah. All right, Nick, any final thoughts here about this race?
So, I guess we always give a predicted winner during the pod. I guess I should give my winning prediction, right? I think I gave Chase Elliott. Was that right?
I don't really pay attention.
I think it was Chase Elliott on the pod. I still like Chase Elliott. I think he's my pick to win the race. Other drivers I think have the highest probability of winning: Truex, Larson, and I would probably go with if I had to pick like a dark horse, maybe somebody like if you're looking for a betting, dark horse or whatever, either Erik Jones or Ryan Blaney.
Jones and Blaney. Good stuff.
Yeah, who said I don't like Jones? What the? Like, come on.
Yeah. Your model seems not to like Jones.
Yeah, I mean, you can't perfectly model everything, especially at Auto Club. So especially with not a huge history for Erik Jones. He hasn't been able to build up that resume where he's had a lot of good, strong finishes at the large ovals. But that's always early in the season is really tough, especially with drivers like rookies and drivers that have changed teams like Clint Bowyer, for example. Those are always the hardest to model. So I try to do some things to account for the fact that they're either rookies or changed teams, but it's an imperfect process.
All right, so that's going to do it for this NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. For Nick Giffen on Twitter at RotoDoc, I'm Matt Friedman, Matt F. the Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.